Dead Cells is fucking great. That's pretty much all you need to know about it. I've been spending a good few weeks now playing it, and I am not really into roguelikes. I very much like Metroidvanias, which this does have some elements of, but for a game like this to hold my attention, it needs to have some absolutely sweet gameplay, and this is one of the best kind of 2D action games I've ever played. So for those of you who don't know, Dead Cells is essentially a fast-paced 2D roguelike with a heavy emphasis on combat, whether it's melee, range with bows and arrows, using traps and grenades. It gives you a huge assortment of different weapons and equipment to deal death to various enemies, but it basically sets you on a run where you've got to get as far through the game as possible, if not to the end, and if you die, you start all the way back to the beginning. But a bit like a Metroidvania is that you'll gain, if you get to certain points in the game and defeat certain powerful enemies, you'll get permanent abilities that let you take shortcuts, go to alternative paths. It's a really interesting blend of the two genres. But first and foremost, this is a roguelike. You will run, you'll get experience, which comes in the form of cells in this game. You'll be able to spend those cells at the end of each section on upgrades, which make you more powerful, which increase the chances that you will get through to the end of the game on your next run. And there's games like this I've played plenty of. Rogue Legacy was probably the last one I spent a lot of time with. You've got things like Faster Than Light, which is a very kind of different type of game, but another roguelike basically. When you die, you lose all of your progress and start again. And those games tend to frustrate me because I never tend to get too far into them, but I never get too far into them, and as a result I get frustrated through my lack of progress, and I drop off them. But now I've been playing Dead Cells for a number of weeks, and I'm still really enjoying it, and that's primarily down to the gameplay. So I mentioned that this is a very heavy action game, and I mean, you'll be able to see on the footage that we're playing behind this voiceover. You're basically going through and just smashing enemies in bloody glory, and it's fast paced, and you're constantly mowing through enemies, and it's the game that's come the closest to feeling like Diablo in that regards. It has reminded me at times where it's all about how efficient can you get at killing enemies as quickly as you can get, and just keeping that chain going and getting through the level as quickly and efficiently and as safely as possible, so that when you get to the next stage, you're in the best possible state to continue on and try and push ahead further. It's definitely the gameplay that's the hook here. It's really, really fast. It's really, really sharp. This has been made by people who know how to know the importance of a snappy, sharp control scheme in an action game. Everything about it is incredibly responsive. You can roll out of danger at a moment's notice. It's all frame perfect. You can launch into attacks from rolls. You can dodge. You can jump. You have an awesome move where you can jump down and smash from above, like a ground stomp move that completely decimates enemies. You've got a really wide-ranging array of mobility and movement options. You can double jump, and everything feels really, really responsive. There's even options to turn off the ability to roll off cliffs, so you can do a smart roll. So if you roll past an enemy and it would normally throw you off a ledge, you can turn that off and just stop your character at that ledge, which is quite a nice option. It means you're not going to be falling into traps or kind of being clumsy. So yeah, I mean, this is a game, and despite, like I say, I usually don't make too much progress, and this is no different. I have not made that much progress. I am now at a point where the first boss is easy to get to and not much of a challenge. I've only seen the second boss once, and they destroyed me. And I think there's about 4 bosses before you hit the basically in the game in a single run. So it's not a terribly long game, but it's difficult. And I mentioned before there's branching paths. So for example, early in the game you can get a rune that lets you tickle little roots, and they grow into giant beanstalks, which you can climb up and access new areas. Now you get that in the second area, which is the Promenade of the Damned, which is kind of the standard second area from the start. You start in the prison, you go to the Promenade after that. You get that rune in the Promenade because you need it to continue on in the main game. But if you then die and go back to the prison, there is a secondary route where you can use this new rune to tickle a vine, make it grow, and it takes you to an alternative second zone called the Toxic Sewers. And that's just kind of an early example of that. I've now also got another rune that lets me use crystals to teleport to other areas, and that's opened up other branching paths. And I know of at least 2 other runes that will allow me to open up. And while you can probably get to the end in about 5 or 6 different biomes, well, that's maybe exaggeration, maybe 8 to 10 different biomes in different areas in the game. I'm under the impression there's somewhere between 15 and 19 overall in the game, and so that's just comes with experimentation, exploration, and just getting through the game and exploring and trying to get better, because the areas where you get these runes get very hard very, very quickly. There's some areas, if you go off the kind of established beaten tracks to some of these alternative areas, they will throw deadly enemies at you very early in the game. And if you haven't been lucky enough on your particular run to get enough power-ups, get decent weapons, you can really find yourself in trouble against some of these powerful enemies. And on the subject of weapons and power-ups, as you go through the game, you will get scrolls, and there are 3 categories. There are tactics, brutality, and survival, which are tactics is purple, brutality is red, and survival is the green. And you can see those kind of numbers in the bottom left-hand side of the screen. And you can get these power-up scrolls that let you put a point in each of them. Well, it gives you a choice of which one you want to put a point in, and what it does is every weapon is associated with a colour or maybe a mix of colours. And if you say you have a sword that is brutality, which is the red, if you pick a brutality scroll, you will get 15% damage bonus to brutality weapons. But what the game does to encourage you to offset this is, so say you have the mixture of brutal and tactical weapons, so red and purple weapons. So you think, alright, the best thing to do is put all my points in the red and purple categories. That's not always the case, because as you put points into each of these categories, on top of the damage bonus, you get a health bonus. It increases your overall health bar. And what the game does is it looks at how many points you've got in a category. It will always offer you that 15% damage bonus. But what it will do is it will give you a bigger health bonus for the category you have less points in. So survival will give you, if you have nothing in survival, it will give you a full 60% health bonus, which is quite big. Whereas if you've got 2 points in brutality, it might only give you a 20% bonus, and it reduces from there. So really it's a trade-off between damage and survivability, and whatever is your focus. And that comes into the kind of the beauty of this, because depending on the weapons you get in a given run, because that's randomized, you can build your character to different strengths against the equipment that you have to hand. It gives a constant variety and makes it interesting, because one thing I found is none of the weapons are horrible. Some are definitely better than others, but you can usually make most of the weapons work. You might get a spear that will. There's a spear called the Impaler, which I got quite early on, unlocked as a item in rotation, and it does bonus damage if you attack enemies against the wall, because you're basically impaling them to the wall. And I just like the way that weapon feels, but the bonus itself isn't that useful. But then I can equip a Spartan Sandal weapon, which is basically a big kick that knocks back enemies. So I could kick them into a wall and then finish them up by stabbing them multiple times. And then you can put modifiers on weapons that set things on fire, make their bodies explode, unleash a cloud of worms to attack and eat your enemies. You can basically end up with these crazy builds, and sometimes it just falls into place where you have an absolutely spectacular combo of weapons and abilities, and they all just really link together and make you absolutely devastating. So I mentioned before, you get melee weapons, which range from spears to swords to knives to giant hammers to broadswords, whips. There's a huge amount of variety, and they're all really, really fun, and they're all very varied, and all have slightly different effects and base effects. Like, you've got the assassin knives, which do critical hits from behind enemies. You've got the bloody sword, which will inflict a bleed on enemies and basically let them take damage over time. You've got range weapons, which range from bows to crossbows to throwing knives, to Molotov cocktails. Elemental attacks like a Sub-Zero kind of ice blast from Mortal Kombat. That's really good. It's good for crowd control, letting you just mow down these frozen statues and go to town on them. And on top of that, you've also got kind of traps and grenades that you can pick up, and they go on your shoulder buttons. And if you look in the bottom left corner, you'll be able to see the LZ and ZR slots that I've got on my screen, because I've been playing on Switch. And they are your kind of your sub abilities or your equipment, and yeah, they come in grenades and trap form. A lot of games would generally kind of restrict you in using these kind of sub weapons, but Dead Cells doesn't. It puts these potentially really powerful added bits of equipment on a really short cooldown, so you can spam grenades. You can just have huge trap builds and set up these absolute networks of death traps, just like a meat grinder in the small areas. You just mow down enemies. You've got grenades that burn people, that just explode. You've got things a grenade that roots people in place. You've got ice grenades, and on the traps you've got things that fire out arrows, like crossbow gun turrets almost. I've unlocked one that's a meat grinder. It puts loads of circular saws on the ground and just tears up everything that walks through it. There's a huge variety, and they're very effective, and not just an extra bolted onto the gameplay. They are a core part of your build and can be built, and you can build your character as such. So the amount of equipment is absolutely staggering. I mean, I've got dozens of weapons in rotation now, because as you go through the game you'll occasionally get a blueprint dropped, and what the blueprint does is it will put it in the end of level shop, where you can spend your cells, your currency, and basically if you put enough cells into that blueprint you'll unlock it. Depending on the power, the strength of that particular weapon, it'll determine whether how many cells you need to put into it. But basically once you've bought that blueprint, it will then fall into rotation. It basically will be able to appear in the game on the various areas where weapons drop the little plinths and things like that. And it also might spawn at the start of the game, because when you start the game you get a choice of a melee weapon, a shield, and a bow, and you can pick up 2 of them out of the 3 that's on offer. And I mentioned earlier that one of the things you can do is put cells into permanent upgrades, and one of the upgrades is to randomize the weapon that you get at the start of the game. So basically you can randomize things and you get more choice, which is good because it keeps things interesting, but it's also a bit of a double-edged sword, because what it means is if you find a combination you really like and do particularly well with, the more weapons you put into your blueprint pool mean essentially you've got less chance of actually seeing those combinations come back round. So while it does keep things interesting, it's probably a downside for efficiency. So really, I wouldn't say that's a negative. It's just it's a trade-off for the design choice there. But there's so many weapons. I don't think I've seen even half of the weapons, if I'm perfectly honest. This is a huge game. I think even if you can get to the end of it, there's going to be a huge amount of content to go back and complete. So I think there's really 2 layers of this game. There's actually getting through and killing the last boss, and then there is unlocking everything, because when you start the game you will go through a little room which has loads of jars in it, and it will show you every jar that's populated with an item is something you've unlocked. So it shows you all the items that you haven't unlocked, and it's a staggering amount. Seeing as how much cells some of these things cost, this game could keep you busy for years. And the combat, to be honest, if you really get into it, the combat is good enough that you could probably play it for years without getting bored. As I say, this is something as close to Diablo as in terms of getting me with that hook of the gameplay and the building something to grow strong and making progress and pushing yourself. It's got that fantastic loop. Now, with this being a roguelike, I mentioned before, sometimes I get a little bit bored because I fail to make progress. I get stuck in a loop. I end up playing the same areas again and again, and I'm kind of in that track right now. But Dead Cells does a number of things to try and keep things fresh, I would say. And the first thing is, obviously, I mentioned that there's the split path and the deviating path, which brings in the Metroidvania aspects of getting these permanent upgrades that give you alternative abilities. So one time you always start in the prison. I might go through the toxic sewers one time, and then the next I might go through the Promenade of the Dead, and so on as things deviate and branch off. But what it also does is there are special time gates it puts into a lot of the levels where they will shut if you take too long to get to them. So what the game does is it encourages you to essentially speed run levels you're familiar with and maybe don't want to have to fight your way through wholesale. So say the Promenade of the Dead, which is the second zone, it has a gate that shuts after something like 2-3 minutes. So if you take longer than 2 or 3 minutes to get through the prison and to that gate in the Promenade of the Dead, it will lock and you miss out on all the bonus goodies. And the bonus goodies are usually a load of money, a load of cells, and maybe even a rare weapon or a rare blueprint. So they are pretty good to get. And what it means is you don't have to grind your way through, because if you're speedrunning these levels, you're going to miss out on killing everything, and killing things is how you get cells normally. So essentially, if you're speedrunning, you're not going to be leveling up and getting more powerful, or at least not getting cells enough to warrant long-term upgrades. So they're a trade-off, allowing you to speedrun, still get a number of upgrades on the way, and keeping you from getting bogged down in the early areas constantly. So sometimes I will speedrun just to get through and try and get these time gates, and I should mention as well, these time gates are spread throughout the game, and they are on a continuous timer. So Promenade of the Dead has like a 2-3 minute one, a later zone has maybe one that's on a 5 or 6 minute timer, and so on and so on. So basically, if you fall behind, it's kind of like this constant race to keep a certain pace of getting through the game to get these time gates, and they are sometimes worth it. Perhaps later on, once you've kind of passed your beginning phase, it's probably better to grind early on against enemies and pick up cells that way. But it's just an alternative thing, which I thought was really interesting, because it just gives you an alternative means of playing the game and focusing on speedrun. So I suppose in terms of what the game is and what it does, I'm really liking it. I think it looks really nice as well. I must admit, I'm not a huge fan of pixel art all the time. I think it's maybe a little bit overdone. When it's done well, it can look really nice. Fez comes to mind. I think that's the last game I really liked, but that was very pixel arty. And Dead Cells looks very much like a 16-bit game. I think though, if you look closely, actually though, it's not really pixel art. What it's more like is, it's kind of like 3D models with kind of like a weird pixel arty filter over them, like a 16-bit filter over them. And it looks really well. It animates very nicely. And it looks cool. It has this kind of 1990s, it reminds me of Comic Zone. It reminds me of that kind of grungy 90s aesthetic. Everything's kind of like a bit grotty and a bit nasty. Even your main character is essentially living goo attached to a corpse, with the idea being that every time you die, your corpse is killed, and your goo is immortal and basically gets put back in prison, at which you break out again and continue the cycle. It looks great, and the variety on the levels are fantastic. Everything looks very, very detailed, very, very different each area. It looks great. So as you can probably tell, I really enjoyed my time with Dead Cells. I'm finding it very hard. I feel like I'm going to have a lot more hours with this, because it's really sticking with me. I mean, it's completely derailed my playthrough Octopath Traveler, which I was going to get a video of as well, and I still might. I'm going on holiday in a month or so I'll take it on holiday with me and try and make some progress with that, and I'll probably come back and do maybe a little bit of a review of what I thought about that as well. But this game, this is Octopath Traveler is a huge 40-hour grandiose adventure, and this little indie game about killing enemies has completely derailed that experience. It's that good. That said, it's by no means perfect, and I do have a few gripes with it. First being that your weapons can get different affixes to them, much like it's like comparison to Diablo. You can upgrade your weapons and get different affixes. So you can have, say you've got a broadsword, you can have an affix on it where it when you hack an enemy, it sets them on fire or makes them explode with a poison cloud or whatever. I mentioned a few of them before. Some of them are a little less clear. There's especially some of them on what they do or exactly. So one of them, for example, talks about doing 100% extra damage plus 100% damage taken. Now, what I took that as, you will deal like double damage, and anything you've taken in the build up to that attack, you'll return to your enemy. What it actually means is you'll deal double damage and take double damage, and that's screwed me over a few times. And maybe it's the way I've read it, maybe the way I took it. I've been a little bit optimistic with hoping that I would be that powerful, but it did confuse me, and I feel like a few runs have been cost. I've been cost a few runs because of that ambiguity. So that's a minus. Some of the language used around some of the affixes is a little unclear, but it's not to the point where it's a huge issue. And I suppose the other major issue I have, I say major, it's not really, is and it's an issue that's probably limited to the Switch, in that in handheld mode it seems to slow down sometimes. It's not a huge issue, doesn't happen a huge amount, but it's definitely there, and it's cost me hits. The game is stuttered, and I've been hit while it's stuttering. And in this game, every tiny little bit of life, every point of life is precious, because you have a finite amount of health potions and means of recovery. So it's important. And when the game its performance is a detriment in such a survival based game, it's a problem. So that's a major thing. But at the same time, I bought it on Switch because I'm far more likely to play a game like this on the Switch, because I can take it on the go. It doesn't happen all the time. It's not something that will spoil the game for you. It's just something to be aware of if you have the choice of platforms, because this is out on PC and the more powerful consoles as well. If the portability of the Switch isn't a big selling point for you, you are probably better off buying it on one of those platforms, because you'll be getting the smoother performance and the better performing game. But that's not to say if you've got a Switch you shouldn't buy this. You totally should. I mean, for the price tag it's asking for, which is about, I think it's around £20, I think just over, it's fantastic. I've played it so much, and I'll probably continue to play it loads. It's probably one of the games that's sticking with me most out of this year, and this year's been a good year for games, so that's how good it is.